Chapter 5 is Social Reform and the Progressive Era. Realities in the early stages of industrial society. Immigrants bore the brunt of industrialization in northern and midwestern cities. Around 21 million immigrants arrived between 1880 and 1914, and employers were unsympathetic to union organization. And few policies or programs existed to protect people from disease, poverty, and poor living conditions. The genesis of reform. Social Darwinism, political power of corporations, and preoccupation with upward mobility created an unlikely environment for social reform at the outset of the Progressive Era. Major events. The Depression of 1893 to 1896 brought widespread disenchantment with corporate tycoons. Americans started to wonder if the growth of industry was a great blessing. Many were alarmed at the size and power of corporations. Intellectual ferment and aroused public opinion. Turn of the century of Americans increasingly believed that environmental factors prohibited healthy growth of citizens. Reformers argued that unregulated economic activity created high levels of social distress. Progressives began to question the U.S. as a model society. The social gospel movement became Christian doctrine, supported social reform. An observation of social ills fostered social reform. The spectrum of social unrest. Most immigrant workers were relatively tranquil during this period. They didn't speak English, they lacked citizenship, and they feared unemployment. The emergence of radical fringe groups and progressivism had a dark side. Some progressives were prejudiced against immigrants and African Americans. They wanted them to embrace middle-class virtues, and they wanted to withhold mothers' pensions from them. Social programs of the Progressive Era. Workers' compensation, mother's pension, juvenile courts, and children's bureau. Mother's pension established between 1911 and 1919, mostly used by widows. And they established juvenile court in some local jurisdictions, which allowed for examination of family situations. Established Children's Bureau in 1912. Private philanthropy. They did not strive to replace private philanthropy and strongly supported these institutions, and they promoted privately funded construction of hospitals. Workers' compensation laws adopted by 1920 in many states established after care services for individuals who were in mental asylums. Health reforms with a flawed capitalistic model. Nearly 20% of the populations of entire cities were killed by epidemics like typhoid fever and malaria. Children died in great numbers from the flu, whooping cough, measles, and scarlet fever. Capitalistic medical care model followed two tracks. The first one is physicians and non-governmental hospitals were funded by fees charged to patients. And the second track is the poor was untreated or sought care from public hospitals, which were unfunded and poorly staffed. The limited nature of progressive social reforms. Most progressive reforms did not require large government expenditures, major benefits, or service programs. And local property taxes were the primary source of governmental revenues and mainly used for schools and public services. Seizing opportunity. Mueller v. Oregon limited work hours to 10 and established minimum wages for women. The National Consumers League, headed by Florence Kelley, sought child labor laws and protective legislation for women. And the Women Christian Temperance Union sought legislation for women and children in addition to temperance legislation. The Bull Moose Campaign of 1912. Democratic and Republican parties had strong wings. After William Howard Taft secured Republican nomination in 1912, defeating Theodore Roosevelt, the Progressive Party convinced Roosevelt to run for president in 1912 on a third-party ticket, which they called the Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt lost the presidential election to Woodrow Wilson, who ousted Taft, demonstrating how difficult it was for third-party candidates to win national elections. The oppression of African Americans, Southern whites regained political power. Supreme Court rulings rendered civil rights useless in the wake of the Civil War. The Jim Crow laws, and African Americans in the North also encountered poverty and oppression. African Americans in the North and South created strategies for coping with adversity, and Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which upheld Jim Crow legislation that required separate but equal facilities. The alliance of progressivism and racism. There was prejudice in the progressive era, racial prejudices, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic. The Immigration Act of 1917 required a literacy test. The evolution of the reluctant welfare state. Progressivism expanded social obligation to include many regulations to welfare and important social programs. Yet progressives obtained remarkable successes in light of many barriers that they confronted. Policies in the progressive era continued onward to subsequent historical eras. Workmen's compensation, the social work profession, women's suffrage, a national network of hospitals, and juvenile courts.